Okay, I started recording, so you can get going.
Okay. So maybe I can start now?
Yeah.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about some information theoretic generalization bounds for SGD. So this is a talk that is based on the following paper. So that was accepted this year at court from Gagagno, Ugaite, Agifam, and Danroy, which talks about, which gives actually upper bounds on the expected generalization gap of stochastic gradient descent using information theory. So the talk, so first I will just present really the very general setting, the setup, the statistical learning setup, the notations. So I think that you will all be familiar with this. Then I will directly present the main result of the paper. So generalization bound, an upper bound on the generalization gap of SGD. I will try to give some intuition of the different quantities that are involved in the bound, and I'll try to give an example for smooth functions. And then I will just talk very shortly about information theory, which is the main theory behind this result. Because like Eugenio talked about that, I think something like maybe 2 weeks ago, something like that. And finally, I will try to detail a bit more the main steps of the proof. So I will not delve too much into them, but try to give the main steps. So if you have any question, please just don't stop me. I try to answer. So first, so the statistical learning setup. So we very classical setting. So we consider a training data set S. So which is IIG. So there is a data generating process P, and all the observations are independent. So for instance, we can consider the regression framework with input-output pairs. So with X, which is the input, and Y, which is the label. We consider a hypothesis class. So W here is not the hypothesis itself, but we consider a parametric model. So with W is the parameter space associated with the hypothesis class. So typically in regression, we can think of neural networks. So the idea is that we'll try to find a neural network F such that it captures the connection, the relationship between the input X and the label Y when they're sampled from P. Then to do so, also to evaluate if the neural network, the chosen neural network is good or not, we consider some loss function. So still in the regression framework, we can consider, for instance, the square loss between the label and the prediction, f of X. And so the way we choose the neural network, or the weights of the neural network, here W, the hypothesis, is done using a learning algorithm. So typically, what is a learning algorithm? It's something that takes into, as an input, the training data set, and outputs a parameter. So typically, you have a gradient descent, which input the algorithm, the input, of the algorithm is the training data set. The output is just the final iterate of the gradient descent. The same for SGD. So, for instance, you can consider stochastic gradient Langevin dynamics, which is a bit different in the sense that the input is a training data set and the output is not just a parameter, but a distribution over the parameter space, but it's the same thing. So as an input of the algorithm, you have the training data set. As the output, you have the final iterate of your algorithm, which can be either a parameter or a distribution. So here in the talk, we will mainly consider SGD. So typically it will be a parameter at the end. And you evaluate, you can evaluate the quality of your algorithm on the training loss, on your data using the training loss, which means that, so here W is the final iterate of the algorithm. So this is a quantity that depends on the training data set S. So you just average the loss evaluated at W over your training data set, and you can do the same when using the test. You can define as well a test loss when the only difference is that your training data dependent parameter is not evaluated averaged over the training data set, but over a test set which is sampled from the same distribution as the training data set. So here I wrote PS, but it's exactly the same as PN. Actually, it's just like the data distribution. So, and the stochastic gradient descent we'll study in this talk actually is the following. So this is very classical actually. You just have a current heat rate, so WT. You evaluate the gradient of the loss. So G here is the gradient of the loss evaluated at the current heat rate, WT. So here, eta t is the learning rate. So I wrote ZIT. Actually, the thing is that for standard gradient descent, so just GD, here G is simply the gradient of the whole training loss. But in the case of SGD, what we are considering are at each step, at each iteration, a small mini batch of the whole training data set. So here, G means that in the case of standard stochastic gradient descent, we just average over the considered mini batch at each step instead of the whole data set. And IT is just the index set of the considered mini batch. And yeah, so the requirements we have on the step size and the sampling rules of the IT is that they are like they can be arbitrary, but they need to be independent of the history of the SGD iterations.
So the sampling rule here is just the mini batch sampling?
Yeah. And what we will study here is the expected generalization gap. So typically, when you want to evaluate the performance of the algorithm, in general, you just take a look at the test loss. So typically, the test loss can be decomposed as the training loss plus the generalization gap. So the generalization gap being the difference between the test loss and the training loss. So if it fits well the data, the training loss is small. And if it generalizes well to test data, the generalization gap is small as well. And the excess risk is small. So here we focus on the generalization gap, which is so the difference between the test data and the training data, which models the ability to generalize to new data. Actually, it's quite known that SGD performs well. Achieves a small value of the training data. So this is the other quantity that we're interested in. And simply here, the difference from just like the difference with just like the difference between the test data and the training data is that here we took the expectation over the training data. So previously, when we defined the training loss and the test loss, it was just defined with a fixed training loss. And here we just took this minus this, but we took the average of that over the training data set. So the test data set here is independent of the training data set. So this is just the classical notion of expected generalization gap. And okay, so it's a bit too large, sorry. And the question we'll try to answer is when does SGD generalize? And to do so, we will derive upper bounds on this expected generalization gap. So the main result, so I will directly give the main result of the paper. So it is an upper bound on the expected generalization gap that mainly depends on three quantities. So the first one is the variance of the gradients along the SGD path. The second one is the perturbation sensitivity of the gradients along this SGD path. And the third one is the perturbation sensitivity of the loss at the final output. So I'm just going to give the theorem first. I will come back to the details of the theorem later, but just to illustrate that here you have the variance of the gradients over the SGD path, because we sum over all the heat rates. So this term is the gradient variance along SGD along the path. Here it's the perturbation sensitivity of the gradients along the path.
So what is this perturbation sensitivity? I have no clue what it is.
Yeah, actually, I will just directly.
Okay, you're gonna explain what it is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's why I will just come back later. And this stands for the perturbation sensitivity of the loss at the final output.
Can I just ask?
Yeah.
Is the training data fixed? Like the expectation over the training data, is that over different samples of potential training data, or is that for a fixed training data?
It's potentially different samples of the training data. So it's like if we have an integral over like dps of S, if you prefer.
Okay, and yeah, so PS is fixed and you're sampling n data points.
Yeah. So this is not something that is empirical and that you can compute. Okay. For instance, in Backbase in general, you can compute the upper bound. Here, it's not something that is computable. So this is one of well, it's not that it is a drawback, but it is something that you cannot have. You cannot compute explicitly this.
Sorry, what's
Yeah.
the part, like you said, the variance of the weight, but like with respect to what? Like, is it like of the gradient? Sorry. So is it like how much the variance is changing during the path, or like?
So at each step within the path, at each step,
Yeah.
the randomness is so the variance over the sample of the training data.
Okay.
So I just like this is the next
Okay.
slide.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first quantity here, it's the that is involved. So there are three quantities. The first one is the gradient variance, which measures the variability of the gradients over the randomness of the data. So this is exactly here the randomness is over the sampling of a training data set, actually. So just to illustrate a bit, so these nice plots are not mine, actually. They are, I took them from the first author of the paper, Gagay. So actually, there are three different situations. So imagine that you are here in the parameter space. So this, the TV is the parameter space. And here, all the arrays correspond to different gradients. And actually, each gradient, each array corresponds to a particular sample of the training data set. So actually, what you have is that here, in this situation, which is the bad situation, we see that depending on the sampling of the sample of the training data set that we get, we see that the variance of the gradient, the gradient, sorry, has a very high variability. So
sorry,
yeah.
Is it with respect to the batch or with respect to the sample? Like, do you fix the indices so given a sample you always set these IP like in the variance? Is it fixed or is it an random factor?
It's random. No?
It's random, yeah.
It's
Okay, so
random.
it's a variance with respect to the sample.
Yeah, to both of them.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you can choose a random
Okay.
or not. If you choose a random, you add the randomness here.
Okay.
If you choose something that is deterministic, it's true that it's something that maybe, because in the paper, actually, all the expectation, I mean, these kind of things are not written, so I try to capture what is exactly. Maybe sometimes I will like miss one source of randomness or not, but
Sorry.
yeah.
G bar shouldn't be conditioned on WT.
Yeah, exactly. This is an interesting point. Actually, it's a quite unusual definition of variance, because you're right. Actually, if you want to talk about precisely a notion of variance, you should have this, but actually it's different like this. And actually, it's even if you take a look at the proof, you could use this conditional expectation here, sorry. But the fact is that the notion of variance, I mean, the intuition behind would be a bit more complicated to capture, to coach, as you say. So this is why they choose this one. But I mean, you can replace the G bar here by the conditional expectation if you want to. So. And what you see is that, so in the good situation, all the variants go to the same in the same direction. So the variability is small, if I can say. And the fact is that here, this notion of this gradient variance will be small. So this term in this situation will be small. The gradient variance in this situation will be large, and in this situation in between, the gradient variance will be not small, not large, just in between. And the fact is that the smaller this quantity, the tighter the bound. So it's better to be in this situation rather than in this one, actually.
So you're averaging over the many batches as well, right?
Yes. I should have written that, but yes, I'm averaging over that as well. Yeah.
What did George say?
The same question as Jenny.
Oh, okay.
Do we average over the many batches?
Yeah.
So that's it for the variance of the gradients. So the second quantity is the sensitivity of the gradients. So this is a bit different in the sense that the randomness is not over the draw of the data of the training data set, but the randomness is over a small Gaussian perturbation in the parameter space. So here, once again, the whole TV, so the whole slide, if you're online, is the parameter space, and it's what we see here is that in the good situation, if we move a bit in the parameter space, then the gradient is not really sensitive to that. We still have the same gradient. This is not the case in this situation. So what we can see is that this notion of sensitivity to a Gaussian perturbation is higher in this case than in this case. And so this quantity that measures the gradient sensitivity, that is the gradient sensitivity, will be much higher in the bad situation than in the good one. And thus, if you're in the bad situation, you will have a large value of the gradient sensitivity and a looser bound. So the better the situation, I mean, if you're in the good one, the tighter will be the final bound. So this is the second notion of perturbation sensitivity. And the third quantity that is involved in the bound is the value sensitivity. So here, we no longer consider gradients, but just simply the loss function. And this is almost the same as the previous quantity, which is actually we measure the sensitivity to perturbation in the parameter space once again. So actually, I think just wait. Yeah, I think I did a small mistake. Yeah, actually here, so S is not, so S here is not the training data set. S is not the training data set, and you do not consider any average of the training data set. Here, S, you could call it the way you want. It's a fixed data set, actually. So it's not necessarily the training data set, it can be the training data set, the test data set, something else, and you need to add the dependence on S here. As you can see here, for instance, there is a dependence on the data set, which is evaluated here in the test data and the training data. So what it says is that if you consider a loss, so which is associated to a given data set, so it can be either, the loss can be either the training loss, if you consider the training data set here, or if you consider the test data set, it can be here can be the test loss. So it evaluates how the loss is sensitive to a small perturbation in the parameter space. So typically, in this situation, in this good situation, we see that if we move a bit from, let's imagine that omega W here is like something like a local minimum, for instance, or something else. But if you move a bit from this minimum here, then the value of the loss does not move that much, actually. So it's as if like the minimum you achieve is kind of flat, actually. So in this situation, then this quantity, which is the perturbation sensitivity of the loss, will be small. In this situation where if you move a bit from this minimum, the achieved minimum, then the value of the loss moves a lot. So it's like as if you achieved a sharp minimum. And in this using this definition of the sensitivity of the loss, then this will be large. So actually, what you it's quite important to understand that. So there are two inputs here, W and S. So I'm sorry, I forgotten to write S, but so it says that this function of W and S is small if imagine that W is a minimum, if the loss associated to S is, if W is a flat minimum of the landscape of the loss defined by S, right? So this is kind of related of the notion of flatness, which is, I would not say that it is a notion that is really related to the notion of generalization because it's quite unclear, but I mean, which is quite often related to the notion of generalization. So if we achieve, so in the bound, as you can see, this notion of sensitivity is evaluated both on the training of the test set and on the training set. So on the test loss, on the training loss. So if the minimum is flat, then the sensitivity is small and the and the bound is tight.
So then the bound, there's like a trade-off for sigma, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there's a 1 over sigma.
Exactly. It's what I will just come back to this, but yeah, you're exactly right. So I come back again to the theorem. So the thing I will say, actually, what you can see is that here the theorem is valid for any value of sigma. Here, any sequence of sigma. So it's exactly what Bobby just said. It's a trade-off. So we can choose the value of sigma, which achieves the best trade-off between all these quantities. So what we can see is that if we choose sigma as a sigma small here, then this quantity explodes. But the fact is that this quantity here will be smaller because, of course, if you decrease the value of sigma. Sigma is the noise, the variance noise actually of the perturbations. So if you choose a value of sigma that is very small, it means that it's as if you do not really perturb your parameter. So in a way, this quantity, all the perturbations quantity will not will be very small. And if you choose a large value of sigma, the sensitive perturbation will be much larger, then this quantity will vanish actually. So this is kind of a trade-off, which is really unclear from the theorem, to be honest. But a good thing is that it can adapt to the some hidden properties of the loss functions, depending on the context and even along the SGD path.
They give example where they know how to kind of like pick those sigma. I mean, I'm sure like, there's a trade-off, but I mean, what do you do in my, okay, I've got this thing for sigma, but practically, if you wanted to have a sharp bond.
Practically, it's not feasible because actually this sigma cannot even depend on the data.
Even like not exactly, get some insight into what to do.
So they give an example, so we'll just give it just a few last slides later on the example of smooth functions, how we can design sigma so that we achieve vanishing bounds. And yeah.
For the first step, is there any intuition behind it? Because I don't have any intuition.
You're talking about the sigma?
The first term, yes.
So, sorry, the first what?
There's two terms, right?
Here?
The second term was the previous thing that you were just explaining.
Well, yeah.
But I don't have any intuition for the first term.
This one?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the first term is this, so it's the sensitivity of the gradients. It says that if you move a bit in the parameter space, then your gradient should not move too much, actually.
Yeah, I mean.
But I agree, but it's the intuition, no? I understand the term, but okay, anyway, maybe he's going to do the proof and we'll see where it's coming from, actually.
Yeah, actually, it's like a trade-off. I mean, yeah, using in the. So maybe we can come back to this later.
But if there's large variance in the gradients, it means that you're going to move one step can move very far. Like the end result of one step can be very far in the parameter space. So it's like by bounding, you sort of have control over where you're going in the parameter space, which intuitively suggests it might.
Since SGD is also stochastic, right? So you want to stay close to the parameter.
Yeah, I don't know. It's like middle there, the sensitivity of the gradients.
I find it a bit weird though, because like if you had a really ill-conditioned, if you had like a really ill-conditioned quadratic, you could move a tiny bit in parameter space, but like if you did like natural gradient, it would still be pointing towards the minimum. But if you take the gradient, it would change a lot. If you had a really ill-conditioned quadratic function, so it's like in some way. You shouldn't be penalized for that, but you will be here.
Well, are you talking about the natural gradients or the?
No, yeah, because it's only you looking at first order information. It's
yeah.
Like you're going to be. It seems like that bound is not. You're getting penalized for some in the case where you shouldn't be getting penalized.
You don't even have a bound for something, but not for some specific case.
It just seems maybe a bit unsatisfying.
Well, I don't know. Just like make.
I'm just saying, like, if you have a quadratic which is really steep, then you move a tiny bit in parameter space, your gradient is going to be very different because you want to be pointing towards the minimum still. The gradient will be very different but somehow the minimum is still the same.
Yeah, so to be honest, so you're saying that if you're considering a square loss, for instance, in regression, then this will be large, but it's like, so the bound won't really, account for this.
As in, the bound will be really loose, but it's still like a complex.
But if you have a quadratic loss, you're going to look at the gradients, it's going to be linear, and I guess the term is over order sigma squared. So it's sigma squared over sigma squared, and there's an eta to compensate.
Yeah, but then there's also it's eta over eta squared, but then there's also like the condition number of the quadratic.
Yeah, it's
which is you're going to be
just
beta.
doing a sigma modeling. But you know,
And
it's fine to go. Yeah.
but another point, yeah, I'm not sure to what extent this is really significant, but there is another assumption in the bound, which is here the R square R term, which comes from actually a sub-Gaussian assumption we make on the loss. And actually, this sub-Gaussian assumption, which is quite popular in the quite classical in the information theoretic counts theory. Actually, I'm not sure it holds, and I'm pretty sure it does not hold for for the square loss in regression. So even though I'm not sure this inequality holds, I mean, in regression itself. So even though, yeah, so I mean, yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah, sorry.
So in regression, it depends on your data. If your data is Gaussian and that's quadratic, then yeah, it won't hold. You may have something slightly weaker, but it won't hold.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
I will believe in us, otherwise you can't case to understand what those bond set tells you. Just figure where I get love and understand what can you proceed, Badr? We should see the proof actually.
Yeah, sorry. And the proof is at the end, so I will try to go fast.
No, take your time.
So yeah, the summary. So it's just a remainder of the quantities. So the first one is the variance of the gradients. The second one is sensitivity of the gradients. The third one is the sensitivity of the loss. So there are some limitations of these quantities that are involved because actually, as we can see, just like think, for instance, think that we evaluate the three quantities. So I'm sorry here, once again, we do not take the expectation of the training data set and we add the data S, which is not necessarily the training data here, okay? And actually, what we can see is that there is a huge dependence of these quantities on some notion of geometry. I mean, all the variances are evaluated in the Euclidean distance, and all the perturbations are using isotropic Gaussian perturbations, and I mean, if you, for instance, you just take a look at the flatness of the loss. To come back to the flatness of the loss, I mean, the notion of flatness itself is very subjective in the sense that if you use, for instance, if you change the parameterization, just you use, for instance, just like you rescale your parameters, then a flat minimum can become a sharp one. Also, it's possible, it's very likely that, for instance, I don't know, that the gradients, or how to say, the gradients can have a much lower variance using some norms that are different from, for instance, the Euclidean one, which is used here. It's possible that the smoothness probabilities of the losses along the SGD path are not the best when expressed in this norm. So, I mean, there is kind of limitations of the choices we made to just define these quantities. And actually, there is like an extension of the following theorem, which says that it is possible to change the definition of each of the quantities without changing the theorem. So typically, they say that if you choose a different, you can choose different norms than the Euclidean one, and you can choose different perturbation from this one. Instead of considering an isotropic noise, you can consider noise that take into account the different directions, because the sensitivity of your losses can be different depending on the direction. And you have these results, which also, once again, I'm sorry here, there is no randomness over the training data set, and this data set is the same one as the one that should have been defined there. And so this is what you can see. So here, instead of the Euclidean distance, we have this one where actually it's not just, so the quantity times the quantity transpose It's like the quantity times the inverse of the matrix times the quantity transpose, which takes a bit more into account the geometry of the loss. And here as well, the perturbation you have like the choice of the. I mean, you can change you can take different perturbations depending on the direction you choose. And this is valid for any covariance matrix sigma t. So what you have actually, what the theorem says, it says that it's even more than just you can choose the sequence, the fixed sequence of sigmas. It's like you can choose the geometry in which the bound will be tight. So as soon as there exists a geometry in which the bound is tight, because a given geometry can be like, you can have two of the quantities that are small and not the other one. If if there is a geometry that achieves a good trade-off between the three quantities, then you will have a tight bound.
So it doesn't have to be diagonal.
No, not necessarily.
But it does have to be inverted.
It has. It's a like covariance matrix that needs the inverted.
Do you understand how like you have your bound, like you do some parameterization and I don't know, you find your bound is some sigma. Then if I consider another sort of parameterizations, like I'm shrinking some direction or something like that, I can always find an incovariance so that I achieve the same bound.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so okay, so that I will just give a small example using smooth functions and to show what we can have. So it's a very so it's a very simple case. So we consider a fixed value of the learning rate, a fixed value of the the mini batch size is the same for all the int rates. So yeah, one data point cannot be used twice at two different time steps, iterations. The gradient or the variance of the gradient, is under control, and finally the gradients or the loss function are smooth, which means like we have some Lipschitz condition here. And what we can have as a result is, so here the sigma is the same. It's not a sequence of, or at least it is a sequence of the same sigma. And the result that we have is this one. So this result is not perfect in some aspects. For instance, if you just like, it is known that the size of the mini batch is better when it's a small one. And in this bound, actually the bind becomes tighter as the mini batch size increases up to a critical point when this ratio achieves this one. So actually, this is not a thing that is just like you can see in practice, but yet it is quite interesting in the sense that we can still achieve. We see that we can achieve like a trade-off when we minimize over the value of sigma. That is still not clear, but a bit clearer, and we see that it depends on the variance to batch ratio. And another observation is that, so here the learning rate, the bound becomes tighter as the learning rate decreases. But of course, it is not recommended to do so, because if you just choose a learning rate which is too small, then the training loss will be just way too bad. So it's like as well a trade-off between the both quantities, the generalization ability and the fitting ability. And just to show what, depending on the choice of sigma, we can achieve. So we have, so it's just the same result. I just recall it. So we investigate two situations. So a small batch case and the large batch one. So in case of a small batch SGD with a B, which is like a constant, what we have is, so in general, if we choose like a learning rate which is like 1 divided by the square root of n, we should be able to achieve a good convergence rate. So this is not possible using this, but yet we can still obtain a vanishing bound. So I wrote equal, but it's not equal. It's like of order, of course. So here we see that if we choose like a good value of sigma, we can still achieve a vanishing bound, which is definitely not optimal. And even the choice of the learning rate cannot be the one we would have wanted to, but yet we have a result. And in the case of large batch SGD, because we just saw that actually a larger batch size is better, then we can achieve a decreasing value of the generalization bound that scales as 1 divided by the square root of n.
I think in practice, like people tend to scale learning rate and batch size linearly, and you can perform quite well with large batch size if you. It's like kind of like you increase the batch size if you have like a central limit type theorem for the gradient noise, then you can increase the learning rate linearly to kind of preserve that. And so it's weird there because it's like it's eta squared over b with that thing, so it's like linear in that. You know, if scaling learning rate and batch size is what you're supposed to do, with people doing practice, then it would cancel out.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the results are far from being optimal, and I mean, the authors are like honest with that. They say that it's not optimal, there are a lot of limitations, but yeah, it's just like this. I mean, these are still the first explicit rates we can get for SGD in the general non-convex setting. So there are very large number of limitations, but I mean, they are honest with that. And yeah, so if you don't have any more questions, so I will try to be very, very fast with the information theoretic part, just to try to see the proof a bit. So yeah, just to motivate a bit the introduction of the information theory. So the very, I would say the very basic approach for providing generalization bounds is uniform convergence, but it is very limited, mainly because it totally ignores the interaction between the training data set and the final output of the iterate. So the learning algorithm takes as an input a training data set and output a parameter W or a distribution. So this, if you consider like uniform convergence, you totally ignore the algorithm, and definitely this will not lead to good things. So what is the approach that you should adopt? So it's one that really takes into account the interaction between the data set and the input of the algorithm and the output of the algorithm. And the information theory is perfect for that. So so it's just kind of a motivation. So why does it generalize? Okay, so typically some notion, I presented it previously, so I will not spend too much time on that. They have like related, it is known that flatness can explain good generalization, even though there are some flaws, so difficulty to define it clearly, so the problem of parameterization, and so on. And there is another notion of that can explain generalization, the notion of stability. So if we move a bit the training data set, the performance of SGD will not move too much. So this is exactly related to the interaction between the training data set and the output, the input of the algorithm and the output of the algorithm. And this notion of stability can be defined in an information theoretic way. And this is the one we'll be interested in. And this is the one that is exploited in this paper. So typically, the key idea is, so here I say a randomized learning algorithm. So we can think the algorithm as something that takes as an input a training data set and outputs like a distribution over the parameter space instead of just a single parameter. And if you're doing this, you're doing so. So the idea is to say that it's stable if the learning algorithm does not reveal too much about the training data set it has been trained on. Okay, so if you take a look at the output of the algorithm and you do not have too much information about the input, then you can have some notion of stability. And this notion of stability is very can be very clearly formalized using information theory. It's what we call the mutual information. And actually, the mutual information exactly quantifies the number of bits of information that the learning algorithm leaks about the training data set into the parameters or into the randomized parameters, so the learning distribution, the distribution it learns. And how can we use that in order to get a generalization bound? So this is the following result that has already been presented by Eugenio a few weeks ago. So mainly due to Russo and Zhu, and maybe more like presented in the, I would say, the machine learning setting by Zhu and Roginski a few years ago. So we have an upper bound on the generalization gap, on the expected generalization gap which is equal to exactly the square root of the information, of the mutual information between W and S, which means between the input and the output of the algorithm. So there is just one modification here in the definition of the generalization gap, which is simply that here, instead of considering a single data-dependent parameter as the output of the algorithm, we consider a data-dependent distribution over the parameter space. So we just consider the average over this data-dependent distribution parameter. So this is, except that, exactly the same definition that we use for the generalization gap. And the mutual information is defined as the KL divergence between the joint distribution over W and S and the product of the marginal. So exactly the mutual information quantifies the information that the algorithm leaks into the training data set about the parameter or the distribution it has. And so we can apply this to SGD to just get our bound, but actually it's not feasible in practice for one very simple reason, is that actually if you don't have a distribution, but SGD is something that is deterministic, I mean, it's not a distribution over the parameter space, the information, mutual information is equal to the infinity. So the point is that we cannot directly apply this theory to SGD because the mutual information, which is a natural bound, actually just explodes. So what we can do, and what is the main idea that is done here, is actually that we will modify a bit the SGD, we will perturb the SGD. For instance, if you take a look at SGLD, it's a perturbed version of SGD. So what we will do is that we will perturb SGD, but artificially, only in the proofs, not in the algorithm, and show that the generalization gap of SGD is almost the same as the generalization gap of the perturbed version of SGD, but the perturbed version of SGD has a small value, or at least a value of the mutual information that we can control, actually.
Is this still infinite if you take into account randomness of the initialization?
Yeah, on the mini batch noise, no, if it's not, it's random basically. I don't say you don't know it analytically, but it's random.
Yeah, I think that you're right. Yeah, I think that you're right. But I think it should be a bit.
It's not, like, it doesn't have a random, like, you're like going to sort of not continuous space.
But if you were, I guess, having
like you were selecting kind of like,
yeah, it's quite so depend. Then it will depend on the initialization, I guess. If you had an initialization that was random as well, like that would basically have
Do they tend to
But
cause
then
zero
the part
zero
is not
initialization?
depending on
Yeah, they do not talk at all about the initialization. So I think that I can't remember precisely whether
yeah, but it's
anything, but yeah, I think it should be very complicated to consider.
It's, yeah, it's very
Yeah, but yeah, you're right. If you consider the initialization, don't think about that.
But isn't it like the initialization will depend on the version? So it's kind of, you can kind of factor out the initialization.
Sorry?
Can't you kind of factor out the initialization? Because here you are considering the dependence of the randomness of W with the data and without the data, but the initialization is independent of the data anyway.
But there's interactions between the initialization and the data,
The
which affects how the algorithm trains.
I think that's a good question, but I've not seen anything about that in the paper. And yeah, actually, you're right. But I mean, I don't know what to answer. I mean, at least, yeah, it's very likely. I mean, this will be like maybe not infinite, but I don't see how to directly control that actually.
It's just
But basically, the idea is that they use is to perturb the SGD and to consider the generalization gap of this modified. So very, very shortly, just, yeah, a bit like warm up, just we consider SGLD and we see how we can move from SGLD to SGD. And so typically SGLD, so very simplified version of SGLD is the following. So at each step, we perturb actually the standard SGD algorithm. So like we add a perturbation and then we compute the gradient at the current step and so on. So this is the SGLD algorithm. And actually there has been a bound that has been given. So the hat here stands for the generalization gap of SGLD that has been given in a work of Penchia, Jog, and Low. So to be honest, it has not been given in this form in their paper because they use some Lipschitz smoothness assumptions, but it can be written like that. And actually, we can see that actually it's very related to the previous generalization gap of SGD, because we can see that the only difference, the main difference is that this is valid for, so for SGD, you have some like sequence of sigmas which are actually defined here in SGLD, which are the gradient noise of the perturbation that does exist, whereas here is something that does not exist, and we can take the best one in a way. And we have two additional terms, which are the sensitivity of the loss and of the gradients, which do not exist in the case of SGLD. So yeah, very briefly, a few remarks. So in a way, the fact that SGLD is, so maybe we should consider like a fixed initialization for the SGD, because it would be a bit more complex. But if the fact that SGLD is like a distribution, randomized learning algorithm, we don't need actually in the quantification of the generalization gap to take into account the sensitivity term. It's a bit more stable. But the fact is that actually this is compensated by the fact that the training loss is in general a bit larger. Actually, it's much more complicated to feed the data. So when I'm saying pushed into the training error, it's not like it's not exactly pushed into the other. It's just an idea. And but the huge, I don't know if it's a huge advantage, but the fact is that here, if you want you just consider SGLD, you get rid of this. Tuning the value of the sigmas of the gradient noise is something that is not necessarily easy in order to balance, a training loss and the generalization gap. Here, it is something that is not easy at all as well, but that can be done at least in theory, actually. And it's not something that is computational depending from the data. So. And what we consider, and the idea of the paper is to say we cannot do that for SGD. We can do that for SGLD. So because SGLD is like a distribution, so we'll try to perturb, but just artificially in the proof SGD, so that we can get something between SGD and SGLD that gets a finite value, or a value of the mutual information that you can control, and a generalization gap that is close to the one of SGD. So this is the idea. And actually, the idea is at each step, we randomly perturb the SGD, actually. So we add, it's really artificial. We add a noise at each time, but it's only present in the proof, not in the algorithm. And actually, what we have is that if you take a look at the gradient, the generalization gap of SGD, it's equal to the generalization gap of this quantity plus this. So it's very easy to see because the generalization gap is equal, so the generalization gap here, it is equal to this minus this. And the generalization gap of the perturbed SGD is equal to this minus this. So we can just write it like that. This is very simple. If we take a look at what is that, we can see that actually this is exactly the definition that we had of actually the notion of flatness, the local sensitivity I introduced previously. So we have the third term, which is the local sensitivity that comes from the difference between the two generalization gaps. And this quantity is just upper bounded using the information, mutual information of the perturbed SGD. So this is the idea. And the only thing that is left is to control the mutual information of the of the perturbed SGD algorithm. So this is the only thing that we have to do. And how we can do that? Actually, so yeah, sorry, I just want to show that the perturbed SGD is just between both of them. So actually, it can be defined in two ways, two alternative ways. So like that or like that, which means that either you consider each SGD iterate and you perturb it using a Gaussian noise, or you can define it in an iterative way, in the same way as, for instance, SGLD, but the difference is that the gradient is not evaluated at the current state, but the non-noisy current state. So this is kind of an in-between between SGD and SGLD. And actually, this is quite important because this will be used in the proof, actually. So And the fact is that the mutual information of this perturbed SGD can be written like that. So it's exactly an in-between in the sense that if you consider the mutual information of SGLD, you don't have this sensitivity. So it just, the mutual information just removes, we just remove, the sensitivity of the gradients in the mutual information of the perturbed SGD so that you can get the mutual information of SGLD. And yeah, so this is the only thing to do. If you're able to do this, you're able to prove that to get your final results actually. And how you can get this? So I will not delve too much into the proofs because it's a bit. There are a lot of computations at the end of the proof, but very shortly to present the main idea. So the first idea is something that has been actually done in the proof of Pensia and his co-authors on the paper on SGLD. So the beginning of the proof is just data processing inequality plus the train rule applied to the Kullback-Leibler. So here we just wrote the mutual information. So this is exactly equal to this by definition of the mutual information. This is upper bounded by this. This is due to the data processing inequality. What you can see is that here, the first term is the mutual information between WT tilde and S. Whereas here it's the mutual information between the whole sequence of interest, of tilde interest, and S. And the data processing inequality says that if you can think of the things of the Markov chain, so you take as an input the training data set, you get the sequence of iterates, and then you just consider the final iterate. You can see that the mutual information between the input and the whole sequence is much larger than the information that it leaks between the input and just the last iterate. So it's like quite sensible to get this data processing inequality. And then this is very easy, just like a simple train rule. So we get this. And actually to bound this, we can simply see that, simply see. Actually, this reduces to introducing, so ghost iterates, what we can call ghost iterates. Actually, it's like, you can see all the prime, the ghost quantities here are just like, they have exactly the same distribution as the non-ghost ones. So you can say it's as a test set. You sample a test set, and using a test set, you define all these quantities as well. So it's like quantities that do not exist, but have exactly the same distribution and the non-prime ones, right? And when we can see, this is quite an artifact, but it's quite useful because it makes it possible to write this. So we rewrite this as an integral. And so this is exactly this quantity here inside the sum. And actually what we see is that this scale inside the integral is just exactly equal to the curl divergence between WT plus 1 tilde and WT plus 1 prime, given that the path iterates W1 and W tilde are equal to this, and that the ghost iterates, the ghost path iterates are as well equal to this, and that the data set is equal to this. So it's like you can write it as a conditional KL. And actually, this conditional KL can be upper bounded using this lemma, which is actually the one key lemma in the paper, actually, which says that if you have two perturbations of a distribution, you can upper bound the KL of this. You can upper bound the KL, sorry, using the Euclidean distance between the initial random variable. Sorry. So from this, WT plus 1 can be written as a function of the past iterates using these formulas. It's why I told you that the formulation using not just you perturb SGD, but you define an in-between version of SGD and SGLD, is important because here, this KL you will write it as a KL between quantities involving that, and then this KL will be bounded using this. And now you will get as an upper bound these quantities, which is using the Gauss quantity, which is exactly so this KL, just this KL inside inside the integral is upper bounded by this quantity, just using this lemma. So if you write this involving the ghost samples and use this lemma, you can get this. And what you recognize is exactly the form of the gradient sensitivity, actually. And here, if you take so you have many different sources of randomness. You have the randomness over the training data set and the randomness over the perturbations. And this is why if you invoke the gradient, the population gradient G bar that was involved in the definition of the gradient, and you split all the terms here, so this minus G bar plus G bar minus that, and you split everything, then you will get exactly the quantity that we have in the upper bound. And this is as well, you asked why the G bar was not a conditional expectation. Actually, this is the reason. You can involve a conditional expectation due to this inequality. But it was just to introduce a more maybe intuitive notion of gradient. But it is possible as well. I mean, you can here invoke either the population risk G bar or the conditional population risk you want, given the conditional expectation here. And then the proof follows, and you have like the final result. And just to conclude, I think, yeah. Just to conclude, so yeah, so what this paper mainly, what is the main take-home message of the paper is that if the gradient sensitivity, the local sensitivity, and the gradients are small, then you will have a good generalization, yeah. But there are many questions actually. So how is it possible to measure them, because it's not like the bounds are not empirical, or like quantity that we cannot compute. It does not answer the question, why would SGD make this quantity small? It only says that if this quantity are small when evaluated as SGD, then we have a tight bound. It does not say how to adjust SGD so that we can achieve small values of these quantities. It is not clear whether these conditions are necessary, and probably not, actually. So it's just so finding a lower bound seems a bit complicated to me. So there is a question of the geometry, because even though the extension of the result allows for larger geometries, well, not, I mean, many more. Another point is the choice of the surrogate. So the way they artificially perturb the SGD. So maybe there are smarter ways to do this and to get maybe tighter bounds. And yeah, a last point actually that is not really addressed in the paper, but just the question of the subgaussian assumption. It's just I think that the assumption is a bit strong, I think, and just simply just I don't know, maybe it could be sort of like interesting to see results about seeing how it is possible to get rid of this assumption.
So about the subgaussianity.
Yeah.
I'm guessing the way it's used is just to control the difference of the two expectations with the mutual information, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So I think you would need some assumption on the moment generating function. Yeah. So subgaussian means it grows like quadratic. Yeah. You can assume, for example, it grows like some power less than 2. It will probably have to be more than 1. And then you can use the same argument as in Xu and Roginski, and potentially you're going to get a slightly different bound. So you can get rid of it, but I mean, I'm not aware of any assumption that's commonly used where you replace the quadratic by something else.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I don't know as well.
I mean, the quadratic things gives you the
Sorry?
The quadratic things give you the square because it's the inverse of the division transform. Yeah, so if you have some other complex function,
yeah,
not much information, but I'm not sure how much it can be really weakened. I mean, unless you change kind of.
And what I don't know is if it would cover the case of regression with quadratic loss. But it should be because that should give you exponential tails of the loss.
Yeah.
But I don't know if, yeah, but it should be possible to test. I mean, it's just a simple calculation. in the appendix of the Stern-Roginski paper.
I mean, what you have in the back-based community in order to get rid of the subgaussian assumption is to just like to rely on different notions of, I mean, it's not the relative entropy, the KL that you consider. It's like you can get rid of the boundedness or the subgaussian assumption with I mean, much more robust results. Sorry, by using different different divergences, because you use the KL as in the mutual information. So I don't know, maybe replacing the mutual information by another metric information. I don't know, like a phi. I don't know if it exists, just like a mutual phi information or something like that. Yeah, this kind of.
That's Gabrielle, she's a specialist.
Yeah, I heard. I was like, yeah, that's it. Yeah. So, no, I don't know if it's been applied yet. So that was like, I had a question last time after your talk, like, are people using Badr-Eddine?
Because they did for quadrates.
Yeah, I mean that could be done in theory. I mean, but as the fact is that I don't know anything about mutual like Renyi or phi information, so it's quite difficult to know what it is.
There is this paper about quadrates which probably can be extended easily.
Yeah, there is a paper of Pierre Akin and Benjamin Gage on that with the hostile data. And what they say is that if you replace the, you can get totally rid of the boundedness assumption or the subgaussian assumption, but you instead of considering KL divergences, you replace it by phi divergences, and you get so there is a main drawback, which is that you lose the logarithmic dependence in the confidence parameter. But here the results are in the expectation. So I think that even this main drawback, you don't get this, but it would definitely replace the mutual information by another notion of information. I don't know.
All right. Any other question? I have talked about it. Hi, George. Bye. Bye, everybody who's attending. Yeah.
See you guys.
So I've recorded it. We can discuss at some point about posting on YouTube. Bye, everyone.
Nice.
It's going to get viral.